Hello and welcome to the Daily Dose. This week, we are looking at some of the most well-known families in the Bible. I think a lot of times we assume that if it's a family that's in the Bible, it must be a picture-perfect example of what a family should be like. But we're reminded when we look even just at a few stories of families from the Bibles that just like your family and my family, they are anything but perfect. They are anything but ordinary, in fact. And sometimes their relationships, when we try to analyze them and try to figure out what we could maybe try and learn from these stories, when we do that, we discover that these families are downright awkward. So today, I want you to open your Bibles to Genesis chapter 4, where we read about the oldest sibling rivalry known to humankind, the rivalry between the brothers Cain and Abel. Now, this is early, this is chapter 4 in the book of Genesis, the very first book of the Bible, which we call the Old Testament. And if you remember, if you look at the book of Genesis, you have spent the first 3 chapters reading about God's creation, where God took darkness, God took disorder from the world and brought light and beauty and order. We hear about the sea and the sky, the animals, the plants. We read about all the goodness. But then we also read about the chaos that happens in the Garden of Eden when humans rebel against God and try to become like God. We read about the first time that relationships are hurt between one another, when Adam and Eve suddenly have a lack of trust between each other and between humans and God, where human authority tries to have the upper hand over God. And I think that's important to keep in mind when we look at these stories of awkward families in the Bible, remembering that they are all broken humans trying to figure out what their relationships look like in a world that is also hurt. So here in chapter 4, Adam and Eve, they have a child, and their firstborn son is named Cain. We learn that Cain is a tiller of the ground. He worked in the fields. And Adam and Eve have a second-born son, and his name is Abel. Abel's role is different from Cain's. We don't learn a lot about that, but he is a keeper of the sheep, the Bible does tell us. Now, I want to pause for a second and speak to all of you who have siblings. Or if you don't have siblings, maybe you had multiple children, so you raised siblings. And I want you to think about the times when you realized they were very different from one another, or you were very different from your sibling. I have one sister. She's younger than I am. And when you look at pictures of my sister and me when we were young, she is often wearing a skirt or a dress or fancy shoes. If we would have had access to Disney princess dresses as easily as you have today, you can bet she would have been wearing one all of the time. But me, on the other hand, no thank you. That was way too fancy for me. I was more focused on being pragmatic, being practical. I can remember as we got older, I tried to differentiate myself from my sister in other ways too by holding my authority as the oldest sibling over hers. When we went on road trips, maybe you can relate to this, there was a definite line in the back seat, and she was not supposed to cross that line. If her stuff or even her leg crossed the line, I would promptly push it back to her side. She would whine, my parents would roll their eyes at me and remind me to act like the older sibling in this situation and try to be a little more mature about the whole thing, which really wasn't a big deal. In our family, our 2 boys have their own versions of sibling rivalry that show up in our household all the time. One boy will accomplish something in school, and the other one is immediately jealous, even though one is older, one is younger, and then they act out in some way. Or this year, our older son got something for his birthday that, of course, as parents, you know this happens, it promptly broke. He was mad, and of course, he blamed who? His younger brother. One kid's frustration with his brother comes out by stomping up the stairs and slamming doors. The others comes out in issuing the silent treatment or just muttering things under his breath. And as parents, no matter what the sibling rivalry of the day, of the moment, of the minute happens to be, sometimes we stand back, we look at them, and we wonder, how could 2 kids who we think we raised in a very similar way? How could they be so different from one another? Sibling rivalries. I'm guessing you can think of your own version. Well, back here in Genesis, it doesn't take long for this particular sibling rivalry to escalate. It has to do with offerings that Cain and Abel give to God. And we learn that God favors Abel and his offering, and it makes Cain jealous. Cain's countenance fell, the Bible tells us. And we can almost picture Cain with his arms crossed, his eyebrows furrowed, giving a big in frustration at his brother and at God. So then Cain takes his brother out to the field, to the place where he works, and the sibling rivalry, it turns tragic when Cain kills his brother. God, who has spoken before, speaks again and says, somewhat ironically, "So Cain, where is your brother?" To which he replies with sass in his older sibling voice, "I don't know. Do you think I am my brother's keeper?" But of course, Cain knows. Of course, God knows. And then God responds by telling him that those fields that he used to till, that he used to tend to, that land is now cursing him. It won't yield any crops. And Cain, in fact, will be a fugitive on the earth. This is the consequence for Cain's heinous actions. And then it's as if Cain realizes all of a sudden the magnitude of what he's done. He wishes for his own death. But God says, no, you need to continue to live with this consequence of your actions. And God sends Cain away from God's presence. This sibling rivalry from the Bible is intense. So what can you and I take from this as we think about our own awkward, sometimes messed up, sometimes even dysfunctional families? Well, I think it's important as we look at this story in the Bible to look at that interaction between God and Cain in the field. In verse 9, we hear, "Then the Lord said to Cain, 'Where is your brother Abel?'" See, God knew there was conflict between the brothers. But here it's as if God is saying, "Cain, he's your brother. Do you see him? Do you truly see him for who he is, even though he might be different from you? Even though he did something at that moment that was better than you when he was offering his sacrifice?" And we hear Cain's response, "I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper?" Sarcastically holding up his hands and say, "Hey, I'm responsible for me alone, and not for my brother." And I wonder if in these short verses, in this story, which isn't very long, where we learn of the tragic way a sibling rivalry came to fruition in the Bible, I wonder if these verses remind us that we are descended from this story of brokenness as well. We will have jealousy show up in our families, but God is inviting us to respond to the question, do you see your brother or your sister, your sibling? By saying, yes, I do see him or her, even though we're different. Even if there's a family rift that seems to be monumental, I'll remember that I see them and I will be my brother's keeper, even when it's hard. Thanks for watching the Daily Dose with us this week. If you've got your own challenging family moments that you're trying to make sense of, be sure to tune in to these stories all week long. Send us a message. We'd love to know what you think as you look more closely at these awkward families in the Bible. Thanks so much. Have a good day.